Good evening. Today's lecture is on forest soils and how soils affect how we do forestry in Ontario. Globally, where we have a forest is dependent on not just the soil, but more on the weather. So anywhere that it's humid enough, you will have a forest. If we don't have enough rainfall, we end up with a grassland. And if there really isn't enough rainfall, you end up with a desert, obviously. But grasslands can be rich, slightly forested to pretty sparse. And the tundra is basically the same idea. You're getting that lack of water, that desert environment, not because there isn't enough water, but because that water is frozen. So winter is a sort of drought. In Canada, our forest soils are podzels, brunsels, and luvisols. This is showing you the height of those forests, which is interesting to me. That where you have moderate temperatures and high rainfall, you end up with some higher forests. Forests are a habitat that we have been watching slowly go in decline. This is not something that's happened fast. If it happened fast, I think we might have gotten very upset about it. It happened very slowly. There is no one alive that remembers there being forests in Europe. They've been gone for 1,000 years. But we're watching the forests of Africa disappear. We're watching the forests of Brazil disappear. We're watching the forests of Borneo disappear. And we're seeing it in Canada, the United States, and other places as well. This is a really cool website about forest decline, but also forest growth. It shows you the change in forests, whether there are more forests than there were or less forests than there were. It's a fun way to waste an hour online. Definitely look up Global Forest Watch. The idea of forestry, of protecting our forests while still cutting them, is a fairly modern idea. We used to just cut down trees when we needed them, and we didn't think about the long-term effects of that. And it wasn't until the late 1700s that a gentleman in Germany recognized the importance of protecting those trees. And he recognized the importance of soils in growing a healthy forest. So he started to study the forest soils, and he saw that in places where they had been actively logging and removing trees, the forest soils weren't as fertile as the places that had been left alone. So he saw that connection between how the forest and the soil work together. And they started that early in Germany. It wasn't until 100 years later that other countries started to really take forestry seriously. And the very first school of forestry was opened in Canada in 1907. Today, we have 4 English-speaking schools of forestry and 2 French-speaking, which is pretty cool. We have 2 in Ontario, one at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay and one in Toronto. I've had several students travel out to BC to take forestry as an adventure. We're really, really lucky in Canada. We have so much forest that is public land. So we call it Crown land in Canada, but it's basically public land that we have access to. Most countries do not have as much public land as we do. In theory, that publicly owned land should be better protected because we don't have laws protecting forests that are on private land. You, in theory, can cut down all the forests on your own personal property, whereas forests on Crown land have a lot stricter regulations. Typically, the soils underneath that forest dictate what species can grow, but what makes sense, the opposite is true, that what species are growing will be indicators of the soil type. They have an effect on each other. In Ontario, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, the MNRF, have defined ecological units, and they've done this based on the soil type, like where the bedrock is. They've done this based on the climate, the temperature, the precipitation, what type of soil is there, and they also look at the main types of vegetation, like the tree species. For foresters, it is really important to know the type of soil and the type of trees in order to classify what ecological land classification you have. Foresters who are primarily interested in tree species and the forest ecology, in order to classify a forest, they need to know things about the soil. They recognize how important soil is to classifying a forest. Here's an example of an ELC classification. The G stands for Great Lakes St. Lawrence Lowlands, which is where we are. We're not quite boreal. And then this particular classification is number 073, and it has tall trees. And it's called a sugar maple hardwood in moist, coarse soil. So the two main things in this title are the type of soil and the type of tree. So you can see here that the texture family is one of the important things. Do we have sandy soil, silty soil, clay soil? The depth of it is important. How deep does that soil go before you hit bedrock? The moisture, how wet is that soil? Are you in a wetland or in a dry area? And then the chemistry. Is it acidic soil or alkaline soil? Those are the main things. Texture and moisture are more important than the other ones because we see more change in our forest types based on those. The soil texture, or in the forestry field, they typically call it the soil family, because in soil science we talk about texture. What percent sand do we have? What percent silt? What percent clay? But in forestry, they look at sort of a family of soils. You have the family of sandy soils. And sandy soils are going to have more porosity. It's going to be easier for roots to grow. It's going to be well drained, but you're also going to have low nutrients because that well drained soil is going to pull all the nutrients as the water flows out. It's going to leach out nutrients. Silty soil family is going to be less porous than the sandy ones, but still capable of roots to be able to push, but slightly more inhibited. It's not going to be quite as well drained as the sandy soil and probably have a few more nutrients. Clay soil family is going to be difficult for roots to penetrate deep, so sometimes the roots will grow out sideways. It's going to be poorly drained, so you're probably going to have trees that are water tolerant. And because there's clays, you're going to have a high cation exchange capacity, so you might have some more nutrients available. When foresters talk about loamy soils, they're talking about the soil family of just a mixture, a good mixture of stuff with some organic matter in there. And peaty soil family is a really high organic soil where you don't have hardly any mineral content. Typically, these are really water-saturated soils. That's why it's peaty, because they're talking about the sphagnum of bogs and fens. So I want to talk about some specific tree species and some of the interesting histories behind them. The eucalyptus genus of trees is originally from Australia and some parts of Polynesia. They thrive in really sandy, dry soils. And they're adapted to wildfires. As we've learned recently, Australia has a system of wildfires just like the boreal forest of Canada does. Miners in Peru introduced eucalyptus and planted them thinking it would be a really good erosion control. As they were digging into the sides of these mountains, they're having a lot of erosion problems. What they didn't understand was that this tree would be highly invasive in that area. And because they have shallow roots, even though they'll grow really quickly in sandy, arid soils, they're not very good at soil stabilization because the roots are so shallow. So they weren't really a great choice to help combat erosion. And it is now still a problem in Peru fighting invasive eucalyptus trees. Locally, we can look at spruce trees and learn a lot about forest soils based on what species of spruce we're looking at. So I teach this in my first and second year environmental science that white spruce, Picea glauca, is not very tolerant of poor conditions, but they are really great competitors. So they'll outcompete other trees. They prefer really well-drained soils that are nutrient rich. But black spruce, Picea mariana, is not a good competitor. So it is quite tolerant of wet environments. So you'll find it in these nutrient poor, poorly drained soils. So if you're in a wetland and you see a spruce, it's probably a black spruce. And if you're upland and you see a spruce, it's probably a white spruce. But conversely, if you see a spruce and it's a black spruce, you probably have a saturated soil or even part of the year is saturated with water. And if you see a white spruce, you probably have a fairly nutrient-rich, well-drained soil. Our beautiful sugar maples are one of the most shade-tolerant trees. You hardly ever find sugar maples outside of a shaded forest. We do plant them other places, but that's their typical habitat. They are pretty tolerant of different soil types. That shade tolerance seems to be their biggest factor, but they do have deeper roots than most maples. So you will find them in places where you have slightly deeper soils. You're less likely to find them in shallow soils. And they actually can use a hydraulic lift. So they can get their roots deep enough to draw water from lower soil levels up higher. The juniper, or in southern Ontario, they call them red cedar. So if you're from like near Belleville, Kingston area, red cedars, but it's a member of the Ontario juniper. It prefers really clay limestone soils. So you don't see them here in North Bay. We don't have the right soil. They're very tolerant of poor drainage conditions. So you often see them in these flat alvar soils that are waterlogged. But the juniper itself requires enough nutrients that they can reduce the soil of nutrients that were there and make it less habitable for other plants. So they block sunlight for other plants, they change the pH of the soil, they use up whatever nitrogen is there, and they change the carbon balance in the soil. They are not really good at playing nice with others. But something really cool ecologically is cedar waxwings really prefer the I'm going to call them berries. Juniper trees have a weird cone that actually has a berry-like look to it. Juniper berries are like these little blue berries, but it's actually their cones. And the juniper tree actually depends upon the cedar waxwing, where seeds that have gone through a cedar waxwing's gut are more likely to germinate than seeds that haven't. So that's all looking at different soil types. And now I want to look at soil depth. The depth of the soil really changes what kind of trees can grow there. In our area, we have very shallow soils. So you either have bedrock that is only a few feet below the surface or shallower. And where you don't have bedrock, you'll have really coarse fragments where you have large boulders and rocks on top of that bedrock before you have that soil. So it has a huge impact on what trees can grow there. Trees are really, really large root systems, so they need room for those root systems. And some trees have really deep tap roots, so they wouldn't be able to tolerate a shallow soil. So trees with tap roots, things like hickory, walnut, white oak, hornbeam, these are trees we don't have in our area. Some trees have heart roots. In this picture, they're called them net roots. So our red oaks and basswoods have these, and a lot of the pines do, not all of them. But these ones sort of grow in a clump, and you'll have a few going out, but most of them are in a bit of a clump. And then we have flat roots. So these are the ones that are growing sort of out flat along the surface. Most of our birches do this, and some of our maples. This means that those taproot species, they are only growing in places where there are deep soils. So these maps are showing us places that are much deeper soils than what we have up here. Whereas our soils are super shallow, and that means the root systems are super shallow, which means they're not as supportive, and we frequently get whole trees tipping over. So if there's a big windstorm and a tree has a taproot, it's less likely to be pushed over in that storm. And if it does, it'll get broken at the trunk. But in these shallow soils, we'll have trees get knocked over and their whole root systems come up. And this has a huge effect on the soil and the ecosystem generally, because you're exposing all those lower horizons to weathering, and you're mixing those horizons. And this changes the local soil structure completely, because you're allowing water and oxygen and organic matter deeper into your horizons, not to mention what that dead tree adds to the ecosystems in terms of organic matter and nutrients. So we looked at the soil family, texture, we looked at the soil depth, so now we're going to look at the soil moisture. In forestry, we have this lovely chart to help us figure out whether we have dry, moderately dry, fresh, moderately fresh, very fresh, moderately moist, moist, and very moist. Fairly general categories, and it is dependent upon where we find evidence of water. The chart down here, you can see these little g's and big G's. That's saying at what depth we're finding glaze and mottles. So if you have a very moist soil, you're going to be finding glaying right in the first 2 centimeters. Whereas if you have a pretty dry soil, you're not going to be finding any glaze at all. If you have a fresh soil, you're going to be finding glaze and mottles in those columns. So we look at this where the dry soils are only getting water through rainfall, and they might have some deep groundwater available to them, but they're not having a water table that's fluctuating into the water column. Most of the trees you see in dry soils are tolerant of drought. Fresh soils have seasonal groundwater fluctuations. So this is where we see those models, where we have in the spring typically higher water levels and then dry seasons where that water goes up and down, and you get to see those models. Sometimes these will be leach soils. So this is where we see our podzels, where we have well-drained soils and nutrients are getting leached out of them. Typically, they have really good oxygen levels, though. Moist soils are areas where we might even call them a wetland. You have seasonal wet soils. So they're moist because most of the year they're dry, but part of the year they're quite wet. The trees we see growing here are tolerant of water, and we typically have a decent organic layer because of that wetland as well. And then last, we have wet soils. These are pretty much saturated most of the year with water. In Ontario, our wet soils are often also highly organic because our treed wetlands are usually bogs and fens. They're usually low in nutrients, but high in carbon because of the organic matter, and typically quite acidic. And the trees you find growing there are very water tolerant, very tolerant of poor nutrient conditions. This brings us back to our ecosite page, where we can see that this particular sugar maple hardwood is a coarse, loamy, sometimes sandy soil. It is a fairly moist soil at 4, and that says that up here too. Here's our moisture, moist, right? Dry, fresh, moist, very moist, wet. It is a deep soil, and it is non-calcareous, so a little bit acidic. Calcareous being like a limestone soil. Which brings me to soil chemistry. Basically, we're looking at calcareous, non-calcareous, and saline. Those are the 3 main soil chemistry types that foresters are looking at. In Ontario, we're looking at our glacial bedrock soils that tend to be typically acidic, and then we're looking at our limestone soils that usually have higher levels of calcium and sodium, so they're alkaline. And that really changes the species of trees. So you'll hear me talk about Carolinian species. These are species that are adapted to those more alkaline soils that you find in the United States, in the eastern part of the United States. You will find them in parts of southern Ontario where we have those same alkaline soils. And you used to find them in a lot more places, but there are too many people and not enough spaces for forests to grow. And that's all I have to talk about forest soils today. Short lecture and possibly our last lecture. Enjoy.